They met at a stranger's funeral, claiming to be the dead person's secret lover. Two strangers meet while pretending to be the same person's secret partner. But their shared grief sparks something real. Welcome, dear viewers, to another journey with love enchanted. Today's story speaks to that part in all of us that sometimes hides behind carefully constructed walls, afraid to be seen, yet desperately longing for connection. This story reminds us that love often finds us in the most unexpected places, sometimes even beginning with a lie. But isn't that the beautiful paradox of human connection? That our most authentic relationships can emerge from moments when we're least authentic? As you watch this story unfold, I invite you to reflect on your own masks and the courage it takes to let someone see behind them. Because sometimes, the people who truly understand us are those who recognize our defenses and love us anyway. Settle in, open your heart, and join us for a tale about two lonely souls who found truth in the midst of deception and healing in the shadow of grief. Like, share and subscribe to Love Enchanted Stories for stories that touches the heart. Before we begin, this is love from my heart to you. Or maybe, just a small love letter to say thank you. Once upon a time, this channel fell in love. Not with fairy tales, but with the people who believe in them. The ones who cry during the quiet parts. Who pause to feel a heartbeat between the lines. Who still believe that love, even complicated, flawed, impossible love, can be real. Love Enchanted was created for you. The romantic. The hopeful. The heart that's been broken and still dares to open again. So if you're here, you're not just watching a story. You're part of one. Stay with us, for stories that ache, heal, and remind us why love is always worth the risk. Rain drummed against the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Chapel, casting muted colors across the empty pews. The funeral of Graham Ellis was a sparse affair, just as the man had lived. His polished mahogany casket stood alone at the altar, adorned with a single white lily arrangement that seemed to emphasize the absence surrounding it. No family. No friends. Just a casket and an obituary that read, Graham Ellis, 58, passed suddenly. No known survivors. Aidan Cole stood in the back corner, his camera capturing the haunting stillness. He specialized in photographing grief in its rawest forms, abandoned roadside memorials, weathered headstones, and funerals where chairs sat empty. There was honesty in these moments that he couldn't find anywhere else. Perhaps because they reminded him of his mother's funeral 23 years ago, where he'd sat alone in the front row at 10 years old, watching strangers shuffle past with rehearsed condolences. He lowered his camera when the chapel door creaked open. A woman entered, shaking raindrops from her umbrella. Her tailored black dress suggested she'd come straight from somewhere important. Dark hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail revealed sharp cheekbones and eyes that scanned the room with practiced precision. In one hand, she clutched a small leather-bound notebook. Cassandra Rivers, Cass, paused, momentarily startled by the emptiness. She'd expected at least a handful of mourners. Instead, there was just a photographer lurking in the corner and an elderly priest arranging prayer books. She approached the casket with measured steps, remembering the brief encounter in the hospital waiting room a year ago, the night her father had another heart attack, when Graham had been the stranger who offered her a handkerchief and sat silently beside her until the doctor came. Aidan raised his camera instinctively, capturing her profile against the soft glow of candles. Father Thomas approached Cass with a sympathetic smile. You must be here for Graham. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Yes, I was Graham's partner. He wanted to keep our relationship private. 20 minutes later, after paying his respects, Aidan found himself face to face with the same priest. Were you close to Graham? Father Thomas asked. Aidan hesitated. He could simply say he was a photographer documenting urban solitude. Instead, he heard himself say, I was his partner. We kept things quiet. The priest's expression shifted from compassion to confusion. His partner. Yes, Aidan confirmed, the lie settling into place with surprising ease. For the past year. Father Thomas glanced back toward the woman, then at Aidan again. The young lady over there also introduced herself as Graham's partner. Before Aidan could object, the priest had guided the woman over. "Ms. Rivers, this is Mr. Cole." Mr. Cole was also close to Graham. Cass's eyes met Aidan's, sharp, intelligent, and suddenly alarmed. Recognition flickered between them, not of each other, but of the identical lie they'd both told. "How close?" she asked, her voice steady despite the challenge in her eyes. Aidan held her gaze. "I was his partner." A beat of silence stretched between them. "What a coincidence," Cass replied, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So was I." Have you ever found yourself caught in a situation where a small lie led to something unexpected? Share your experience in the comments below. The rain had intensified by the time the brief service concluded. Aidan and Cass stood beneath the small awning outside St. Mary's Chapel, both reluctant to leave yet uncomfortable to stay. The tension between them was palpable as raindrops pounded the pavement just inches from their feet. "So, Aidan finally broke the silence. Graham's partner." Cass adjusted her grip on her umbrella. "Yes. And apparently, so were you." Their eyes met in silent challenge, neither willing to back down from their fabrication. Father Thomas had excused himself to attend to closing the chapel, leaving them alone with their identical lies. "Interesting that he never mentioned you," Aidan said, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "Graham valued his privacy," Cass countered smoothly. "Something I'm sure you're well aware of, being his partner." A hint of a smile played at the corner of Aidan's mouth. "Very aware." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they continued their delicate dance of deception. Aidan studied her with a photographer's eye, the way she held herself with practiced poise, the slight tension in her jaw, the calculated distance she maintained. There was a story there, beneath the polished surface. "Your camera," Cass nodded toward the expensive equipment hanging from his neck. "Professional. Freelance photographer," he offered, deciding this small truth was harmless. "I specialize in urban solitude." "Empty funerals qualify?" "Sometimes." Cass raised an eyebrow. "Most people don't photograph strangers' funerals." "Most people don't attend strangers' funerals," Aidan countered. The comment hit closer to home than Cass was comfortable with. She glanced at her watch, a deliberate gesture to create distance. "I should go. I have a deposition at 3. Lawyer. Corporate." Another piece of truth exchanged, like reluctant currency. As Cass turned to leave, memories of his mother's funeral flooded Aidan's mind, unbidden and sharp as they always were. He'd been 10 years old, dressed in a borrowed suit that hung from his small frame. The church had been nearly as empty as today's service. His mother, Elaine Cole, had been beautiful once, before the addiction hollowed her out, before the series of boyfriends who came and went like seasonal weather, before the overdose that finally took her. The social worker had stood beside him, a stranger's hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to cry, Aidan," she'd said. But he hadn't cried. Instead, he'd noticed everything, the way light fell through stained glass, how the few mourners avoided eye contact, the perfect symmetry of his mother's casket centered before the altar. Even then, he'd been framing shots in his mind, finding beauty in the starkness of grief. That day had been the last time he'd had a permanent address for years. Foster home to foster home, he'd carried only his mother's Polaroid and the ability to disappear behind his observations. "Mr. Cole." Aidan blinked, pulled back to the present by Father Thomas's voice. The priest had returned, keys jingling in his aged hands. "I was just telling Ms. Rivers about the small reception we're holding tomorrow at the parish hall. Nothing elaborate, just a few people who knew Graham from the neighborhood. I'd be pleased if both of you would attend." Cass's expression remained neutral, but Aidan caught the flicker of alarm in her eyes. "I'm not sure my schedule will allow," she began. "We'll both be there," Aidan interrupted, surprising himself as much as Cass. "To honor Graham." Father Thomas beamed. "Wonderful. 2 o'clock, then." As the priest walked away, Cass turned to Aidan with barely contained frustration. "What are you doing?" Aren't you curious? He asked, genuine interest in his voice. About why we both chose the same lie. About who Graham Ellis really was. No, she said firmly. I'm not. But Aidan saw the hesitation in her eyes, the same curiosity that had driven her to the funeral in the first place. 1 hour, he pressed. We show up, pay our respects, and leave. Separately. Cass sighed, remembering the night she'd met Graham Ellis. It had been one of her lowest moments, sitting alone in the hospital waiting room at 2 a.m., mascara streaking her cheeks as she waited for news about her father's condition. The heart attack had been severe, and the doctors weren't optimistic. Graham had been the only other person there, an older man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. He'd offered her his handkerchief without a word. When she'd finally composed herself enough to speak, he'd listened without judgment or platitudes. It's the waiting that undoes us, he'd said simply. The space between what was and what will be. They'd talked for perhaps 15 minutes before the doctor called her name. She'd returned the handkerchief, thanked him, and never saw him again. But something about that brief connection had stayed with her, enough that when she spotted his obituary a year later, she felt compelled to attend. It wasn't the first stranger's funeral she'd attended. Her Goodbye Club journal contained dozens of entries, final letters to people she'd barely known but who had somehow touched her life. It was her secret ritual, her way of acknowledging connections in a world where she kept everyone at arm's length. Fine, she finally conceded. 1 hour. But we need to get our stories straight. Aidan nodded, pulling out his phone. Give me your number. We should talk before tomorrow. As they exchanged contact information, their fingers briefly touched, a momentary connection that neither acknowledged but both felt. We should establish some boundaries, Cass said, all business now. Basic details about our supposed relationship with Graham. Nothing elaborate, just enough to be convincing. Coffee. Tonight. Aidan suggested. There's a place on Lexington that's open late. 8 o'clock, Cass agreed. And for the record, I still think this is a terrible idea. Noted, Aidan replied with the ghost of a smile. But terrible ideas sometimes make the best stories. As they parted ways, Cass to her waiting Uber, Aidan to his motorcycle, neither could shake the strange sense that something significant had just begun. A deception, yes, but perhaps something else too. Something neither had planned for when they'd walked into St. Mary's Chapel that rainy afternoon. Father Thomas watched them leave from the chapel doorway, a knowing smile on his weathered face. In 40 years of ministry, he'd learned to recognize lost souls when he saw them. And sometimes, he mused, the most unlikely connections were the ones that saved us. The rain continued to fall, washing away footprints on the chapel steps, as if erasing evidence of the lies that had been told. But some marks couldn't be so easily removed, like the impression Cass and Aidan had already begun to leave on each other's carefully guarded lives. The Nighthole Cafe on Lexington was exactly the kind of place Aidan frequented. Dim lighting, mismatched furniture, and walls adorned with local photography. Cass arrived precisely at 8, still in her work attire but with her hair now loose around her shoulders. She spotted Aidan in the corner booth, his camera on the table beside a steaming mug. "You're punctual," he observed as she slid into the seat across from him. "Occupational hazard," she replied. "Corporate law doesn't reward tardiness." A barista approached, and Cass ordered a double espresso. No cream, no sugar. Efficient, like everything else about her. "So," she began once they were alone, pulling out a small notebook. "We need parameters for this situation." Aidan leaned back, studying her with that same observant gaze that made her feel uncomfortably seen. "You want to establish the rules of our fake relationship with a dead man." "I want to get through tomorrow's reception without embarrassing ourselves," she corrected. "Basic details only. How long we knew Graham, how we met, why nobody knew about us. And why we didn't know about each other," Aidan added. Cass nodded. "That's the trickiest part." They spent the next 20 minutes constructing a plausible timeline. Aidan claimed the most recent 6 months, Cass the 6 months prior. They decided Graham had met Cass at a hospital charity event, close enough to the truth, and Aidan through a photography exhibition. Both relationships had been kept private at Graham's insistence. What did Graham do for a living? Cass asked suddenly, realizing she had no idea. Retired literature professor, Aidan supplied. I looked him up after the funeral. Taught at City College for 30 years. Specialized in 20th century American poetry. Cass raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. You did your homework. I like to know the stories behind my subjects, he said simply. Their conversation lulled as the barista delivered Cass's espresso. In the momentary silence, Aidan's curiosity got the better of him. Why were you really at the funeral? He asked quietly. Cass stiffened. I told you. You told Father Thomas you were Graham's partner, Aidan interrupted gently. We both know that wasn't true. So why go to a stranger's funeral? She considered deflecting, maintaining the wall she'd built around her private rituals. But something about Aidan's direct gaze made pretense seem pointless. I met him once, she admitted. In a hospital waiting room when my father had a heart attack. He was kind to me during a difficult moment. When I saw his obituary, she shrugged, uncomfortable with her own sentimentality. You wanted to acknowledge that kindness, Aidan finished for her. Something like that. Cass took a sip of her espresso, then turned the question back on him. And you? Just another empty funeral for your collection. Instead of answering immediately, Aidan reached for his camera, turning it on and scrolling through images. He stopped on one and turned the display toward her. It showed an elderly man sitting alone on a park bench, feeding pigeons. Graham Ellis, he said. 3 weeks ago. I was shooting a series on solitude in public spaces. He was there every Tuesday at the same time. We never spoke, but there was something compelling about him. The way he was so completely present with those birds, yet so removed from everything else. Cass studied the photograph, seeing the same kindness in Graham's eyes that she remembered from their brief encounter. When I saw his obituary, it felt wrong that someone who occupied space so meaningfully would have an empty funeral, Aidan continued. So I went. To photograph it? To witness it, he corrected. The camera just comes with me. Cass closed her notebook, suddenly aware of how clinical her approach had been. We're both funeral collectors, aren't we? Just in different ways. Aidan's expression softened with recognition. I capture moments of grief. What do you collect? She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out the leather-bound journal she'd been holding at the funeral. I write letters. To people I've barely known but who affected me somehow. Final conversations I never got to have. May I? Aidan gestured to the journal. Surprisingly, Cass handed it over, a level of trust she rarely extended. Aidan opened it carefully, respecting the intimacy of what he held. Each entry began with a name and date, followed by a letter. Some were brief, others spanned pages. All were addressed to the deceased. The Goodbye Club, he read from the inscription on the first page. It started after my mother died when I was in law school, Cass explained. There were things I wished I'd said to her. After that, I found myself doing the same for others. People who crossed my path briefly but meaningfully. Aidan returned the journal with newfound understanding. So tomorrow isn't just about maintaining our cover story. No, she admitted. I need to say goodbye properly, even if it's to someone I barely knew. As they continued planning their approach to the reception, their conversation shifted from tactical to personal. Aidan described his photography projects. Cass shared stories from her legal career. They discovered a shared appreciation for Leonard Cohen's poetry, fitting, given Graham's literary background. By the time they left the cafe 3 hours later, they had not only a convincing cover story but also a reluctant appreciation for each other. Two solitary people who observed life from different vantage points, Aidan through his lens, Cass through her legal precision, finding unexpected common ground. The parish hall was modestly decorated for Graham's memorial reception. A few photographs of Graham through the years were displayed on easels, and a table held a guest book with barely a dozen signatures. Aidan arrived first, camera conspicuously absent. He'd decided that today he would participate rather than document. Cass joined him 10 minutes later, looking less corporate in a simple black dress. Their eyes met across the room in silent acknowledgement of their shared secret. Father Thomas greeted them warmly, introducing them to the small gathering, mostly elderly neighbors and former colleagues from City College. To Aidan's surprise, Cass slipped her hand into his as they made their rounds, her fingers cool against his palm. "Maintaining our cover," she whispered when he glanced at her questioningly. They moved through the reception with practiced ease, sharing carefully constructed anecdotes about Graham. Cass spoke of his love for Frost's poetry. Aidan mentioned his Tuesday ritual of feeding pigeons. Each detail they shared was true, just not experienced within the context they claimed. "He never mentioned either of you," remarked Eleanor, a former department secretary who'd worked with Graham for decades. But that was Graham, always compartmentalizing his life. "He valued his privacy," Cass replied smoothly, the rehearsed line coming naturally now. "Especially after what happened with Lila," Eleanor continued. "He was never the same after that estrangement." Aidan and Cass exchanged a quick glance. This was new information. "Lila," Aidan prompted gently. "His sister," Eleanor explained. "They had some falling out years ago. I never knew the details, but it broke his heart. He kept her photograph on his desk until he retired." Before they could inquire further, the parish hall door opened, and a woman entered. She was in her early 50s, with Graham's same thoughtful eyes and a hesitant demeanor. The room fell silent as she approached Father Thomas. "I'm Lila Ellis," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet space. "Graham's sister. I just found out about his passing yesterday." Father Thomas recovered quickly, welcoming her with compassionate professionalism. As he led her around to meet the attendees, Aidan felt Cass's grip tighten on his hand. "Complication," she murmured. "Stay calm," he replied under his breath. "We stick to the plan." When Father Thomas brought Lila to meet them, Aidan felt a genuine pang of guilt. Her grief was palpable, her regret at their estrangement evident in the redness of her eyes. "These are Graham's partners," Father Thomas explained, his phrasing deliberately vague. "Aidan Cole and Cassandra Rivers." Lila's confusion was immediate. "Partners? Both of you?" "At different times," Cass clarified quickly. "I knew Graham last year, and Aidan more recently." "I see," Lila said, though clearly she didn't. "I'm surprised. Graham never mentioned either of you in our limited communications." "When did you last speak with him?" Aidan asked gently. 5 years ago, Lila admitted, pain flashing across her face. "We had a disagreement about our family home after our parents died. Things were said that couldn't be unsaid. I tried reaching out last Christmas, but..." Her voice trailed off. "He spoke of you," Cass said suddenly, the lie coming easily when faced with Lila's obvious regret. "He kept your photograph." Lila's eyes filled with tears. "Did he? I was afraid he'd erased me completely." "He couldn't," Aidan added, finding truth within the deception. "Some connections remain, even when we try to sever them." As the reception continued, Lila shared stories of Graham's youth, his early passion for literature, his quiet determination, his tendency to retreat into books during difficult times. With each revelation, the man they'd barely known came into sharper focus, making their deception feel simultaneously more justified and more fraudulent. When Lila mentioned she would be clearing out Graham's apartment the following weekend, she looked at them with unexpected warmth. "Perhaps you both would like to join me? There might be mementos you'd want to keep." The invitation caught them off guard. Their plan had been to attend the reception and then end the charade. But faced with Lila's genuine inclusion, neither could bring themselves to refuse. "We'd be honored," Aidan answered for both of them. As the reception wound down, Cass and Aidan found themselves on the parish hall steps, watching Lila exchange contact information with Father Thomas. "This has gone too far," Cass said quietly. "We should tell her the truth." Aiden considered this, then shook his head. "Look at her, Cass. She's already carrying the weight of a 5-year estrangement. Do you really want to add to that by telling her the only people who claimed to care about her brother at the end were lying?" Cass knew he was right, but the growing complexity of their deception unsettled her. "So we just keep pretending. For how long?" "Until after the apartment," Aiden suggested. "Then we can gradually fade from her life. No harm done." As Lila approached to say goodbye, Cass made a split-second decision and hugged the woman. It wasn't part of the act, it was genuine comfort for someone carrying the same kind of regret that filled many pages of her goodbye club journal. Watching them, Aiden realized their reluctant alliance had shifted into something neither had anticipated, a shared responsibility to protect not just their deception, but Lila's fragile healing process as well. Would you continue a deception if it meant protecting someone else's feelings? Like this video if you would, or comment with your thoughts. 3 days after the memorial reception, Cass found herself standing outside a converted warehouse in Brooklyn's Dumbo district. The address Aiden had texted her led to a nondescript industrial building with large windows that reflected the Manhattan skyline across the East River. She hesitated before pressing the buzzer labeled A. Cole Photography. Their deception had already extended beyond what she'd intended, and meeting outside the context of their shared lie felt like crossing a boundary. But curiosity about Aiden's work, and perhaps about Aiden himself, had overcome her reservations. The door buzzed open, and she climbed 4 flights of stairs to find Aiden waiting in an open doorway. His studio was exactly what she might have expected: exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, and large windows that bathed the space in natural light. What surprised her was the warmth of the space: comfortable furniture, shelves lined with books, and the faint scent of coffee brewing. "You live here?" she asked, noting the small kitchen area and a door that presumably led to a bedroom. "Work and home," Aiden confirmed. "Easier to get lost in projects when there's no commute." He offered her coffee, which she accepted, using the moment to survey the space. One wall was dedicated to his work, photographs arranged in careful sequences. She was drawn immediately to a series of black and white images showing empty chairs in various settings: a park bench, a hospital waiting room, a funeral parlor. "The Absence Project," Aiden explained, joining her with 2 mugs. "I've been working on it for about 3 years." "They're beautiful," Cass said, genuinely moved by the quiet power of the images. "Melancholy, but beautiful. That's what I'm trying to capture, the beauty in absence. The way empty spaces hold memories of those who once occupied them." He guided her through the studio, showing her different collections. Unlike the polished portfolios on his website, these were his personal projects, more intimate, more revealing. A series on foster homes, another on urban isolation, and finally, the collection that had brought Graham Ellis into his viewfinder: solitude in public spaces. "This is where I first saw him," Aiden said, pointing to the photograph he'd shown her at the cafe. "Same bench, same time, every Tuesday. Always alone, but never lonely. There's a difference." "You could tell that from watching him?" "It's my job to notice the difference," Aiden said simply. "Some people are alone because circumstances isolated them. Others choose solitude because they're comfortable in their own company. Graham was the latter." Cass studied the image with new appreciation. "You saw in one photograph what took me an entire conversation to understand." "Different methods, same observation," Aiden replied. "Your goodbye club is just another way of capturing moments that matter." The mention of her journal made Cass self-conscious. She'd never shared it with anyone before the brief glimpse she'd allowed Aiden at the cafe. "Speaking of which," Aiden continued, "I have something to show you." He led her to a work table where a large leather portfolio lay open. Inside were photographs of handwritten letters, fragments captured in elegant black and white. "Last letters," he explained. "A project I started 2 years ago. Final communications between people, some to loved ones before death, others never sent, discovered later. Cass leaned closer, reading snippets of profound emotion captured in strangers' handwriting. How do you find these? Estate sales. Archives. Sometimes families contact me after seeing the project online. He paused, watching her reaction. When you showed me your goodbye club, I immediately thought of this. The parallel wasn't lost on Cass. They were both collectors of final conversations, she through writing them, he through preserving others. Would you consider? Aiden began hesitantly, allowing me to photograph some pages from your journal? Anonymized, of course. For the project. The request should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps because Aiden approached grief and memory with the same reverence she did. I'd need to think about it, she said honestly. Of course. He didn't press further, instead moving to a small safe in the corner of the studio. From it, he removed a worn envelope and carefully extracted a Polaroid photograph. My mother, he said, handing it to Cass. Taken about a year before she died. The woman in the photograph was strikingly beautiful, with Aiden's same observant eyes and a smile that suggested both warmth and sadness. She sat on a fire escape, city lights blurring behind her. You have her eyes, Cass observed. And her tendency to observe rather than participate, Aiden added with a self-awareness that surprised her. She was a poet, unpublished, but dedicated. After she died, I found notebooks filled with her work. Observations about the world, moments captured in words instead of images. Is that why you became a photographer? To continue what she started. Aiden considered this. I never thought of it that way, but maybe. She taught me to notice details others missed. After she was gone, the camera became my way of holding on to moments that seemed to slip through everyone else's fingers. The vulnerability in his admission created space for Cass's own. She set down her coffee mug and reached into her bag for her journal. My entry about Graham, she said, opening to a page marked with a thin ribbon. I wrote it the night after the funeral, before we met at the cafe. She handed him the journal, an offering of trust that felt significant to them both. Aiden read silently. Graham Ellis, April 15th. Dear Graham. We met only once, in a hospital waiting room when my world was collapsing around me. You offered a handkerchief and the simple acknowledgement that waiting is the hardest part. You didn't try to fix anything. You just sat with me in that terrible limbo between what was and what would be. Today I sat in another limbo, your funeral. Empty chairs and a single lily arrangement. I wondered if you had been waiting for something at the end. If there was something left unfinished. I told a lie today. I claimed to be someone important to you. Perhaps it was selfish, wanting to feel connected to something real in a room full of absence. Or perhaps it was my way of ensuring that someone claimed you as significant, because you were, even if just for 15 minutes in a fluorescent-lit waiting room. May you find peace in whatever comes after waiting. Cass. When Aiden looked up, his expression had softened. This is beautiful, Cass. It's honest, she said simply. More honest than I usually allow myself to be. The afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the studio. Aiden made more coffee, and they settled onto the worn leather couch near the windows. Their conversation flowed more easily now, the pretense of their initial meetings giving way to genuine curiosity about each other. Cass found herself sharing stories she rarely told, about growing up in a household where achievement was valued above emotion, where her father's corporate success had set an impossible standard, where her mother's social perfection had taught her that vulnerability was weakness. The night I met Graham was the first time I'd cried in public since I was a child, she admitted. My father would have been mortified. Is he still alive? Aiden asked gently. Yes. Recovered from that heart attack and 2 since. Still running his company, still disappointed I chose corporate law instead of following him into finance. She smiled ruefully. Still keeping score of accomplishments instead of connections. Is that why you collect goodbyes? To create the connections your family didn't value. The question was perceptive enough to make Cass pause. I never thought of it that way, but maybe you're right. My goodbye club is full of strangers who showed more genuine emotion in brief encounters than my parents demonstrated in decades. As darkness fell over the city, Aiden turned on a few lamps but left the studio mostly in shadow. In the dimmed light, the professional distance between them seemed to diminish. They were no longer a photographer and a lawyer maintaining a convenient fiction, but two people recognizing themselves in each other. We're both observers, Aiden noted, his voice lower now. Standing at the edges, documenting rather than participating. Safer that way, Cass agreed. Is it? Their eyes met in the half-light, and Cass felt something shift between them, a recognition that their careful distance from life had led them to the same empty funeral, the same improbable connection. Aiden moved closer on the couch, his hand finding hers in the shadow between them. What if we're missing everything that matters by staying at the edges? The question hung in the air, laden with meaning beyond their immediate circumstance. Cass found herself leaning toward him, drawn by something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Their lips were inches apart when her phone rang, shattering the moment. Lila's name flashed on the screen. Cass pulled back, reality crashing in as she answered the call. Lila, hello. Aiden watched as Cass's expression shifted from momentary disappointment to focused attention. She reached for a pen, jotting notes on a napkin as Lila spoke. Yes, I remember he mentioned that. No, I don't recall the title. Aiden might know, he's actually with me now. Of course, we'll both be there Saturday as planned. Yes, 10 a.m. works fine. When she ended the call, the intimate atmosphere had dissipated, replaced by the weight of their ongoing deception. She's going through Graham's things and found references to a book he was writing, Cass explained. She thought one of us might know about it. A book. Aiden frowned. He never mentioned writing to me. Because you never actually spoke to him, Cass reminded him, a hint of sharpness returning to her voice. Just like I only spoke to him once in a waiting room. We're pretending to have known a man we barely met. The reality of their situation settled between them like a physical presence. What had begun as a simple lie to explain their presence at a funeral had evolved into an elaborate deception involving a grieving sister and increasingly personal stakes. This is getting complicated, Aiden acknowledged. It was always complicated, Cass countered, standing to gather her things. We just didn't want to admit it. As she prepared to leave, Aiden caught her hand. What happened just now, before the phone rang, that wasn't part of the deception. Cass met his gaze, allowing herself one moment of complete honesty. I know. That's what makes it dangerous. She left him standing in his studio doorway, the city lights creating a halo around his silhouette. As she descended the stairs, Cass couldn't shake the feeling that their shared lie about Graham Ellis had somehow led to the most authentic connection she'd experienced in years, and that terrified her more than any deception ever could. Graham Ellis's apartment was on the 5th floor of a pre-war building in Washington Heights, a modest one-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and windows overlooking Fort Tryon Park. The space felt like an extension of the man, understated, thoughtful, and intensely private. Cass arrived precisely at 10 a.m. on Saturday, finding Lila already sorting through kitchen cabinets. The women exchanged a brief hug that felt more genuine than Cass wanted to admit. Aiden texted that he's running a few minutes late, Cass explained, setting down the coffee she'd brought for all three of them. Lila nodded, gesturing around the apartment. I've barely made a dent. Graham was meticulous about some things and completely disorganized about others. The observation struck Cass as intimate, the kind of knowledge that came from truly knowing someone. Her discomfort with their deception intensified as she surveyed the personal space of a man she'd met only once. Where would you like me to start? She asked, eager to be useful. Maybe the study. Graham spent most of his time there. I thought you might recognize things that were important to him. The study was a small alcove off the living room, dominated by a worn leather desk chair and a writing table covered with books, papers, and a vintage typewriter. Cass approached it hesitantly, feeling like an intruder. She was carefully sorting papers into piles when Aiden arrived. Their eyes met briefly across the apartment, the first contact since their near-kiss in his studio 3 days earlier. Both looked away quickly, the unresolved tension palpable. "Sorry I'm late," he said to Lila. "Assignment ran over." "No problem," Lila replied. "Cass is helping in the study. Maybe you could start with the bookshelves? See if there are any volumes you recognize from your time with Graham." Aiden nodded, moving to the wall of books that separated the living room from the dining area. As he scanned the shelves, he couldn't help glancing toward Cass, watching her methodical sorting. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, a stark contrast to her usual corporate armor. The casual attire made her seem more accessible, more real. For nearly an hour, they worked in relative silence, the occasional question from Lila the only interruption. The apartment gradually revealed Graham Ellis's life. His passion for poetry, his meticulous collection of jazz records, his habit of writing notes in book margins. "He was working on something," Lila mentioned as she joined Cass in the study. "A memoir, I think. He mentioned it in his Christmas card last year, the only communication I received after years of silence." Cass nodded, maintaining their fiction. "He mentioned a writing project, but was private about the details." As Lila moved back to the kitchen, Cass continued sorting through desk drawers. In the bottom drawer, beneath folders of financial documents, she found a leather-bound journal similar to her own. The first page was dated 3 years earlier, with entries continuing until just 2 weeks before Graham's death. She should have closed it immediately. Instead, she found herself turning pages, scanning entries, looking for any mention of herself or Aiden. What she found stopped her cold. April 18th, 2 years ago. "The young woman in the waiting room tonight reminded me of Lila, same determined set to her jaw, same vulnerability hidden beneath composure. She was falling apart so quietly that no one else noticed. I offered my handkerchief and she looked at me as if simple kindness was extraordinary. We spoke briefly about her father's heart attack, about the terrible limbo of waiting for news. I didn't tell her about Lila, about our estrangement, about how I've been waiting 5 years for a reconciliation that may never come. Some burdens aren't meant to be shared with strangers. But for 15 minutes, I wasn't alone in my waiting. Perhaps that's all any of us can hope for, brief connections in the midst of solitude." Cass felt her throat tighten. Graham had remembered their encounter in detail, had even written about it. And he'd connected her to his estranged sister, a parallel she hadn't known existed. She continued turning pages, finding more entries that mentioned the young woman from the waiting room. He'd spotted her months later, arguing a case on the courthouse steps. He'd recognized her but hadn't approached, noting in his journal that some connections were meant to remain brief, perfect in their incompleteness. "Find anything interesting?" Aiden's voice startled her. He stood in the study doorway, watching her with that perceptive gaze that seemed to see too much. "His journal," she said quietly, turning it so he could see. "He wrote about me. About the night we met in the hospital." Aiden moved closer, reading over her shoulder. His proximity made her pulse quicken, but she focused on the journal, turning to more recent entries. March 3rd, this year. "The photographer was at the park again today. 3rd Tuesday in a row. He thinks I don't notice him capturing my Tuesday ritual, but I do. There's something respectful in his observation. He doesn't intrude, doesn't try to manufacture moments. He simply witnesses. It's a rare quality in a world where everyone wants to participate, to be seen, to matter. Perhaps that's why I don't mind being the subject of his lens. We're both practicing our own forms of solitude in public." Aiden's expression softened as he read. "He knew I was photographing him." "He understood what you were doing," Cass corrected gently. "He recognized himself in you, just like he saw Lila in me." The realization settled over them. Graham Ellis had observed them both with the same careful attention they prided themselves on. He'd seen them clearly, even as they'd barely noticed him until he was gone. "What are you two finding over there?" Lila called from across the apartment. They exchanged a quick, guilty glance before Cass answered. "Graham's journal. He was quite a writer. Lila joined them, taking the journal with reverent hands. This must be the memoir he mentioned. She began flipping through pages, her expression growing increasingly puzzled as she read random entries. That's odd, she said, looking up at them. He mentions a photographer he observed in the park, and a woman he met in a hospital waiting room, but there's nothing about relationships with either of you. The moment Cass had been dreading had arrived. She felt Aiden tense beside her, his instinct to maintain their story battling with the growing evidence against it. Maybe he kept those entries separate, Aiden suggested. For privacy. Lila's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. Graham was private, yes, but this journal seems incredibly comprehensive. He documented conversations with his dry cleaner, for heaven's sake. She looked between them. Why wouldn't he mention the people he was supposedly intimate with? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer neither could provide truthfully. Lila, Cass began, but Aiden interrupted. We should tell her the truth, he said quietly. Cass stared at him in disbelief. After all their careful planning, after insisting they maintain the deception to protect Lila's feelings, he was ready to confess everything. Now, she hissed. It's only going to get worse, he replied, his voice low but firm. Look at what we've found. Graham documented everything. There's no relationship to discover because there wasn't one. Lila watched their whispered exchange with growing comprehension. You weren't involved with my brother, were you? It wasn't really a question. Cass felt the carefully constructed facade crumbling. The guilt she'd been suppressing surged forward, making it difficult to breathe. No, Aiden admitted, his voice gentle. We weren't. The silence that followed was excruciating. Lila set the journal down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Then why? She finally asked. Why would you pretend to have known him? To have loved him? Cass couldn't bear the hurt in Lila's eyes. I met Graham once, in a hospital waiting room. He was kind to me during a difficult moment. When I saw his obituary, I wanted to pay my respects. I never intended to lie. To insert yourself into a stranger's funeral? Into my grief. Lila's voice rose with each question. It wasn't like that, Aiden interjected. I'd observed Graham in the park for my photography project. When I saw his obituary mentioned no survivors, I went to ensure someone was there to witness his passing. The lie. It just happened. Just happened. Lila repeated incredulously. And then you both continued it, came to the reception, accepted my invitation here. All based on a lie that just happened? Cass stepped forward. We were wrong. Inexcusably wrong. But we did care about Graham, each in our own way. You didn't know him, Lila said flatly. And you certainly didn't know me, or what I needed. She moved toward the door. I'd like you both to leave. Now. They gathered their things in silence, the weight of their deception crushing any attempt at further explanation. As they reached the door, Lila spoke again, her voice tight with controlled emotion. The irony is that Graham would have appreciated what you did. He always said the most interesting people were those who observed from the periphery. But I'm not Graham. I don't find beauty in deception, no matter how well-intentioned. The door closed behind them with quiet finality. In the hallway, the tension that had been building between them erupted. Why did you do that? Cass demanded. We agreed to maintain the story. It was falling apart, Aiden countered. She deserved the truth. Since when are you the arbiter of what people deserve? You're the one who insisted we protect her feelings in the first place. That was before I read his journal. Before I realized how much our lie diminished who he really was. They continued arguing as they descended the stairs, their voices echoing in the stairwell. By the time they reached the street, the disagreement had evolved from their handling of Lila to more personal accusations. This is exactly why I keep people at a distance, Cass said bitterly. The moment you let someone in, everything falls apart. No, you keep people at a distance because you're afraid of genuine connection, Aiden retorted. It's easier to write in your goodbye club than to actually say hello to someone who might matter. The words struck with precision, hitting vulnerabilities Cass had revealed during their afternoon in his studio. And you hide behind your camera because if you're always observing, you never have to participate. Never have to risk anything real. They stood on the sidewalk, both breathing hard, both having landed blows that cut too close to the truth. I have an assignment in Tokyo, Aiden finally said, his voice cooler now. I'm leaving tomorrow. 3 weeks. Of course he was leaving. Everyone always did. Fine, Cass replied, her corporate mask sliding back into place. I have the Westridge merger anyway. 60-hour weeks for the foreseeable future. They parted without resolving anything, retreating to their separate worlds of observation and achievement, both telling themselves it was better this way. Both knowing it was a lie bigger than any they'd told about Graham Ellis. 3 weeks passed like a blur. Cass immersed herself in the Westridge merger, working 18-hour days that left no time for reflection. Her Goodbye Club journal remained untouched, its presence on her nightstand a silent reproach she couldn't bring herself to address. Aiden's Tokyo assignment extended to Kyoto, then Seoul, each extension a deliberate choice to stay away from New York and the complications he'd left behind. His camera captured ancient temples and modern cityscapes, but his thoughts kept returning to Graham's journal, to Lila's hurt expression, to Cass's accusations on the sidewalk. Neither contacted the other. Neither tried to reach Lila. The entire episode might have faded into memory, filed away as a strange interlude best forgotten, if not for the email that arrived in both their inboxes exactly 1 month after their confrontation at Graham's apartment. Subject: Graham Ellis, a request from Lila Ellis. Mr. Cole and Ms. Rivers. I've had time to process our last interaction and the revelations it contained. While I cannot condone your deception, I've come to understand it better after spending these weeks with Graham's journals and personal effects. I would appreciate meeting with you both one final time. There are matters regarding Graham that I believe would benefit from closure for all of us. This Saturday, 2 p.m., at the Riverside Park bench where my brother fed pigeons every Tuesday. Mr. Cole will know the location. Lila Ellis. Cass read the email 5 times, analyzing it with the same scrutiny she applied to legal documents. There was no overt anger, no threat of exposure or consequences. Just a simple request that somehow felt impossible to refuse. Aiden, having returned from Asia just 2 days earlier, studied the message with a photographer's attention to what remained unsaid. The choice of location was deliberate. The very place where he had first observed Graham, where their paths had invisibly crossed. Neither responded to the email. Neither contacted the other to coordinate. But when Saturday arrived, both found themselves approaching the bench from opposite directions, drawn by some combination of guilt, curiosity, and unfinished business. Cass arrived first, dressed casually in jeans and a light sweater against the spring breeze. She spotted Aiden before he saw her, his camera absent for once, his expression guarded as he scanned the park. Something tightened in her chest at the sight of him, a reaction she refused to analyze. Lila was already seated on Graham's bench, a leather portfolio in her lap. She acknowledged them both with a nod as they approached, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. An awkward silence followed as Aiden and Cass took seats on either side of her, maintaining careful distance from each other. "I owe you both an apology," Lila began, surprising them. "My reaction at Graham's apartment was harsh." "You had every right," Cass started, but Lila raised a hand to stop her. "Please, let me finish. After you left, I spent days reading Graham's journals. All of them, going back 15 years. She opened the portfolio, removing a stack of photocopied pages, including these entries. She handed them each several pages. Cass looked down to find an entry dated just 3 months before Graham's death. "I saw the photographer again today. He's become as much a part of my Tuesday ritual as the pigeons. I wonder if he realizes that in observing me, he's revealing himself. There's a solitude about him that feels familiar, the same quality I recognized in the young woman from the hospital. Some people move through the world collecting experiences, others collect observations. I've always been the latter, watching life rather than fully participating in it. Perhaps that's why I notice others who do the same. Aiden was reading a different entry, his expression softening as he absorbed Graham's words. Lila waited until they'd both finished before continuing. Graham was a lifelong observer, she explained. Brilliant at understanding people, terrible at connecting with them. Our estrangement wasn't just about the family home, it was the culmination of decades of distance, of his inability to bridge the gap between observation and participation. She turned to Cass. He wrote about your encounter in the hospital waiting room multiple times. That 15-minute conversation affected him deeply, enough that he recognized you months later at the courthouse. Cass felt a chill. He saw me again? Several times, apparently. He never approached, but he noted your presence in his journal. Just as he noted yours, she added, looking at Aiden. He was aware you were photographing him. He considered you both kindred spirits of sorts, fellow observers. The revelation settled over them. The man they'd pretended to know had, in fact, known them in his own way. Why are you telling us this? Aiden asked quietly. Lila closed the portfolio. Because after reading his journals, I understand why you both felt connected to Graham, even from brief encounters. And I understand why you might have claimed a closer relationship at his funeral. Graham had that effect on people, seeing them so clearly that even fleeting interactions felt profound. She stood, looking out over the park where her brother had spent so many solitary hours. I also wanted you to know that your lie, while misguided, gave me something valuable. For a few days, I believed Graham had found connections that mattered to him. That he hadn't died as alone as he'd lived. The compassion in her voice was unexpected, making the weight of their deception feel simultaneously heavier and lighter. We were wrong, Cass said firmly. Whatever our reasons, we should never have pretended to be something we weren't. No, you shouldn't have, Lila agreed. But Graham wrote something in his final journal that keeps coming back to me. She recited from memory. The truest connections often begin with misunderstanding. We present false versions of ourselves until someone sees through to what's real. She handed Aiden a small package wrapped in brown paper. This was with his personal effects. The note attached had your name on it, though he never mailed it. I think he meant for you to have it. To Cass, she gave a sealed envelope. And this was addressed to the woman from the waiting room. I believe that's you. Before either could respond, Lila gathered her things. I won't be contacting you again. Graham's affairs are settled, his apartment cleared. But I wanted you both to know that he saw you, really saw you, even if you barely noticed him until he was gone. With that, she walked away, leaving Aiden and Cass alone on the bench where their unusual connection had invisibly begun. They sat in silence, each holding Graham's final communication, neither quite ready to open them or to address the unresolved tension between them. I'm sorry, Aiden finally said, his voice low. For what I said that day outside Graham's apartment. It was unfair. It was accurate, Cass admitted. That's why it hurt. Another silence, less strained than before. Did you read all of Graham's journals? Aiden asked. When you were sorting his study? Cass shook her head. Just the entries about us. Why? I've been thinking about what Lila said, about Graham being an observer who struggled to connect. About how he recognized that same quality in us. Aiden turned to face her directly. I've spent my entire life documenting moments instead of living them. Even in Tokyo, I was hiding behind my camera, avoiding what happened here. We both retreated to what felt safe, Cass acknowledged. Me to my 60-hour workweeks, you to your assignments abroad. But it's not really living, is it? Just observing, collecting, documenting, never fully participating. The truth of his words resonated deeply. Cass thought of her goodbye club, of all the connections she'd recorded but never fully experienced. When I read Graham's journal, Aiden continued, I realized I didn't want to end up like him, seeing everything but experiencing nothing. Writing about a woman in a waiting room instead of actually knowing her. He hesitated, then reached for her hand. I don't want to photograph life anymore, Cass. I want to live it. And I'd like to start by getting to know you, the real you, not the person I observed or imagined. The sincerity in his voice broke through defenses Cass had maintained for years. She looked down at their joined hands, then at the unopened envelope from Graham. I'm not very good at this, she admitted. At being known. Neither am I, Aiden said with a small smile. But I'd like to try. No more pretending. No more observing from a distance. As the afternoon light filtered through new spring leaves, casting dappled shadows across the bench where Graham Ellis had spent so many solitary hours, Cass made a decision. She'd spent her life writing goodbyes to connections that barely existed. Perhaps it was time to write a different kind of story, one that began with hello. I'd like that too, she said softly, returning the pressure of his hand with her own. 6 months after their meeting on Graham's bench, Aiden's gallery in Chelsea buzzed with opening night energy. The exhibition, titled Participation, marked a dramatic departure from his previous work. Instead of documenting absence and solitude, these photographs captured moments of genuine connection, some between strangers, others between friends, all vibrating with authentic emotion. Cass moved through the crowd, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. She'd taken the entire day off, something unheard of before Graham Ellis's funeral had unexpectedly altered the course of her life. Her relationship with Aiden had evolved slowly over the past months, both of them cautious, both learning to lower the defenses they'd maintained for so long. She paused before a large photograph near the center of the gallery. Unlike the others, this image was familiar. The interior of St. Mary's Chapel, Graham's solitary casket, and a woman in a black dress standing with her back to the camera. The moment Aiden had first seen her. What do you think? His voice was close to her ear, his hand finding the small of her back with easy familiarity. It's strange seeing myself through your eyes, she admitted. Especially that day. That's the point of the exhibition, Aiden explained, guiding her toward a sequence of images that followed their story chronologically. The moment we stop observing and start participating, everything changes. The photographs told their story without explanation, their confrontation outside the chapel, their coffee shop meeting, moments in Aiden's studio, their argument outside Graham's apartment, and finally, their reconciliation on the park bench. The final image showed their hands intertwined, Graham's unopened gifts resting between them. You never told me what was in Graham's package, Cass said, studying the photograph. Aiden smiled. Come with me. He led her to a private room at the back of the gallery, where a single photograph hung on the otherwise empty wall. It was one of Graham on his bench, feeding pigeons. But unlike Aiden's usual distant observation, this image showed Graham looking directly at the camera, a slight smile on his face. An acknowledgement of the photographer's presence. This was in the package, Aiden explained. Graham had somehow obtained one of my business cards. The note said, when you're ready to be seen instead of just seeing, display this. Someone is always watching the watchers. Cass felt a chill of recognition. He knew. He knew we were both observers hiding from participation. Just like him. Aiden reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small envelope. I have something for you. Inside was a Polaroid, not vintage like the one of his mother, but new. It showed Cass at the funeral, the exact moment she'd entered the chapel, illuminated by colored light from the stained glass windows. I had this developed the day after we met, Aiden confessed. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman who'd told the same lie I had. Cass traced the edge of the Polaroid, moved by the gesture. I have something for you too. From her purse, she removed a folded page from her Goodbye Club journal. Unlike her other entries, this one wasn't addressed to a deceased person, but to a part of herself. To my fear of vulnerability. October 15th. 4 years, I've collected goodbyes without risking hellos. I've documented connections without experiencing them. I've kept everyone at a careful distance while pretending professional success was enough. Today, I'm saying goodbye to that version of myself, the observer who never participated, the woman who wrote letters to strangers but couldn't open herself to someone who might actually stay. Graham Ellis saw something in me during 15 minutes in a waiting room that I hadn't been able to see in myself. And through the strangest series of events, a lie at a funeral, a deception that grew too complicated to maintain, a confrontation that stripped away pretense, I found someone who sees me just as clearly and chooses to stay anyway. So this is my final entry as a collector of goodbyes. From now on, I'm collecting beginnings. Cass. Aidan read it twice, his expression softening with each line. When he looked up, his eyes held the same intensity they did when framing a perfect shot. I love you, he said simply. Not the person I observed or imagined, but you. Complicated, guarded, brilliant you. The words hung between them, honest and unadorned. Cass felt the familiar urge to retreat, to protect herself from the vulnerability such a declaration invited. Instead, she chose participation over observation. I love you too, she replied, the words feeling foreign yet right on her tongue. And that terrifies me. Aidan smiled. Good. Real things should be a little terrifying. 2 weeks later, Cass rushed through JFK Terminal 4, cursing delayed taxis and Manhattan traffic. Aidan's exhibition had been picked up by a gallery in London, requiring a 3-week trip to oversee the installation. His flight was scheduled to depart in 20 minutes, not enough time to clear security, but perhaps enough to catch him before he boarded. She'd been called into an emergency meeting that morning, a crisis with the Westridge merger that couldn't wait. By the time she'd resolved it, Aidan had already left for the airport, his goodbye a brief text message promising to call when he landed. But as she rounded the corner toward the security checkpoint, she stopped short. There was Aidan, seated calmly in the departure lounge, his carry-on beside him, clearly waiting. Your flight, she said, breathless from running. You're going to miss it. I know, he replied, standing to meet her. I rebooked for tomorrow. But the installation can wait a day. He took her hands in his. I realized something as I was about to go through security. Graham Ellis spent his life observing connections but never fully experiencing them. He died alone because he couldn't bridge the gap between seeing and participating. Aidan pulled her closer. I don't want to make the same mistake. So I'm not leaving without a proper goodbye, without telling you that these 3 weeks will feel like forever, without making sure you know that I'm coming back to you. Cass felt tears threatening, a vulnerability she would have once hidden at all costs. Now she let them come, let Aidan see the depth of what she felt. I was afraid you'd already gone, she admitted. That I'd missed my chance to tell you. Tell me what? That I'm ready to stop writing about life and start living it. With you. Around them, the airport continued its chaotic dance. Travelers rushing to destinations, emotional reunions and separations, lives intersecting briefly before continuing on separate paths. But for Cass and Aidan, former observers who had finally learned to participate, the only journey that mattered was the one they'd begun together at a stranger's funeral. As they left the airport hand in hand, Cass thought of Graham Ellis and his solitary bench, of the unexpected ways lives could intersect, of how a lie told at a funeral had somehow led to the most honest connection she'd ever known. Sometimes, Aidan said, seeming to read her thoughts, the most beautiful stories begin in the most unexpected ways. Cass smiled, thinking of the blank pages in her journal waiting to be filled with beginnings instead of endings. I think Graham would have appreciated the irony. I think he orchestrated the whole thing, Aidan replied with a smile. His final act of observation. Sometimes the most beautiful relationships begin in the most unexpected ways. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more tales that remind us love finds us when we least expect it. What unexpected beginning led to something meaningful in your life? 1 year to the day after Graham Ellis's funeral, Cass and Aidan stood before his grave in the quiet corner of Woodlawn Cemetery. Unlike that rainy afternoon when they'd first met, today the spring sun cast dappled shadows through new leaves, and wildflowers pushed through the grass surrounding the simple headstone. It looks different, Cass observed, setting down the small bouquet of white lilies, a deliberate echo of the solitary arrangement that had adorned his casket. Less lonely, Aidan agreed, his camera hanging unused around his neck. Today wasn't for documenting, it was for participating. In the year since their lives had unexpectedly intertwined, they'd created something neither had anticipated. The Connection Project had begun as a personal endeavor, their way of honoring Graham's memory, but had evolved into something larger. They documented the lives of people who died with few connections, researched their histories, and created memorial books for distant relatives who often hadn't known their stories. Cass knelt beside the grave, tracing the simple inscription, Graham Ellis, 1965 to 2023, observer of life's quiet moments. We found his niece in Portland last month, she said softly. Lila's daughter. She never knew her uncle, but she cried when we showed her his journals, his photographs of pigeons in the park. Another connection made, Aidan said, joining her on the grass. Graham would have appreciated the irony, that in death, he's creating the very connections he struggled with in life. From his pocket, Aidan removed the worn Polaroid of his mother, his most treasured possession, the one tangible link to his past that had traveled with him through foster homes and years of solitude. Are you sure? Cass asked, knowing what this photograph meant to him. I'm sure, he nodded. I don't need it anymore. I've learned to carry her with me in different ways. Cass opened her Goodbye Club journal to the final entry she'd written before retiring it to a bookshelf. She carefully tore out the page, her letter to Graham after their first meeting, and placed it alongside the Polaroid at the base of the headstone. Thank you, she whispered, not just to Graham but to the strange sequence of events that had led them here, a funeral with no mourners, a shared lie, a confrontation that forced them both to face truths they'd spent years avoiding. As they stood to leave, Aidan took her hand, the simple gold band on her finger catching the sunlight. Their engagement was still new, still a daily reminder that they'd chosen to build something real from the foundation of a shared deception. No more pretending, he said, echoing the promise they'd made to each other on Graham's bench a year earlier. No more observing from a distance, she agreed. They walked away hand in hand, leaving behind the Polaroid and journal page, symbols of the observers they had once been. The breeze gently lifted the corner of the paper, as if Graham himself were reading Cass's final goodbye, witnessing one last quiet moment of connection that had begun, improbably, at his own funeral. Throughout Aidan and Cass's journey, authenticity emerged from the most unlikely source, a shared deception at a stranger's funeral. Their initial lie, told independently yet identically, became the catalyst for a profound truth neither was seeking. In pretending to know Graham Ellis, they were forced to confront the patterns of emotional avoidance that had defined their lives. This paradox reminds us that sometimes the path to genuine connection begins with acknowledging the ways we've hidden ourselves from the world. I've spent my entire life documenting moments instead of living them, Aidan confessed on Graham's bench, recognizing how his camera had become both his connection to the world and his barrier against it. His art captured the beauty of absence while creating that very absence in his own life, a pattern that began with his mother's death and continued through years of observing grief without processing his own. Similarly, Cass's Goodbye Club journal represented her pattern of collecting connections without risking real involvement. For years, I've collected goodbyes without risking hellos, she wrote in her final entry. Her professional success and emotional distance were protective mechanisms born from a childhood where vulnerability was seen as weakness. Yet these very patterns of avoidance ultimately led them both to Graham's funeral, and to each other. Their shared understanding of grief and loneliness created a bond that transcended their deception. Both recognized in the other a familiar solitude, a tendency to stand at life's edges rather than participate fully. Graham had seen this same quality in them both, noting in his journal, "Some people move through the world collecting experiences, others collect observations. I've always been the latter, watching life rather than fully participating in it. Perhaps that's why I notice others who do the same." The courage to be vulnerable, to step out from behind Aidan's camera and Cass's corporate armor, became the foundation of their genuine connection. When Aidan declared, "I don't want to photograph life anymore, Cass. I want to live it," he was choosing vulnerability over observation. When Cass shared her journal entry about her fear of vulnerability, she was choosing participation over documentation. These acts of courage transformed their relationship from a convenient fiction into something authentic. Before finding truth, they needed to acknowledge their lies, not just the deception they presented to Father Thomas and Lila, but the deeper lies they'd told themselves. Aiden had convinced himself that capturing moments was the same as experiencing them. Cass had believed that professional achievement could substitute for emotional connection. Only by confronting these self-deceptions could they create space for honesty with each other. Perhaps most importantly, they discovered that the people who truly see us are those who recognize our defenses and love us anyway. Graham Ellis saw them both clearly from brief encounters, the photographer hiding behind his camera, the lawyer maintaining emotional distance. Lila recognized the truth of their connection despite its deceptive beginnings. And ultimately, Aiden and Cass saw each other with the same clarity, choosing to love not an idealized version but the complicated reality. "I love you," Aiden told Cass in the gallery. "Not the person I observed or imagined, but you. Complicated, guarded, brilliant you." In that moment, he wasn't just declaring love but acknowledging that true connection comes from seeing someone's full complexity, their defenses, their fears, their patterns of avoidance, and choosing them anyway. Their story reminds us that authentic connection doesn't require perfect honesty from the beginning, but rather the willingness to move from observation to participation, from protection to vulnerability, from collecting moments to living them fully, even when that journey begins with a lie told at a stranger's funeral.